And we're live.
Greetings and welcome to another DML Salons. It's April 23rd and we are here for the second unit of our four-part design-based research strand that's led by the DML Hub and Dr. Kylie Pepler. Today we'll discuss co-design and collaboration in design-based research and consider questions related to three main topics. 1, establishing relationships. 2, co-constructing the design process with participants. And 3, sustaining a project and participation. I am Anna Keune, and I'm a second-year doctorate student at the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University, and I'm co-facilitating the salon with Lindy Johnson from the College of William and Mary. And we are super excited to welcome our invited panelists, Megan Bang and Philip Bell, who bring a range of backgrounds and expertise in co-design and collaboration in design-based research. I'll let everyone introduce themselves. Lindy, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindy Johnson, and I am a first-year assistant professor of curriculum and instruction at the College of William and Mary.
Thanks so much. Megan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Bang, and I'm a professor in the Learning Sciences and Human Development at the University of Washington.
Thank you. How about Phil?
Hi, I'm Phil Bell. It's nice to join everyone today, and I'm also a professor of Learning Sciences and Human Development here at University of Washington and direct a center focused on science and math education.
Really cool. Thanks so much. So in today's conversation, we will ask you, Megan and Phil, to tell us a little bit more about a specific project and sort of your relation to design-based research and how you've involved collaboration in your work. And then our conversation will focus on those three topics that we prepared: establishing relationships, co-constructing the design process with participants, and sustaining a project and participation. So just two more things before we dive into our conversation today. So if you are watching this Hangout from the DML Commons webpage, we would really like to encourage you to jump on the Etherpad and to start conversing with each other and sort of the other people who are watching, or to join the conversation on Twitter using the DML Commons hashtag. Throughout this webinar, we will be mentioning resources, and we'll be sharing those on the Etherpad throughout the unit, the next 2 weeks of the unit 2. And so you can find the link to the Etherpad, to open that Etherpad, on the unit webpage on DML Commons in the sort of the bottom part of the webpage under the research section. And once you open the Etherpad, it would be really great if you could add your names under the roll call section, just so that we know that you're here. Also, feel free to add any suggestions to our discussion topics that are right below, post questions, or note relevant resources that you might be thinking of. And so the second way of engaging, we would really like to ask you to share and promote examples of co-design and collaboration in design-based research using maybe the Twitter handle or your DML blogs. And just to invite everybody to add to that sort of growing pool of resources. And so a few examples were already shared through the professional pathways strand that started this week as well. And we'd just really like to encourage you to sort of add to that pool and maybe to even sort of visually note some of the learnings that may come out of this Hangout. So just to get started, we have prepared a small warm-up activity to learn a bit more about who is in this Hangout here today. And maybe we could learn a bit about our everybody here by sort of going to the Etherpad. And so in the section right below the roll call, we have a section called Warm-Up, and there's a link to a Google Drawing. And so if you click on the link, a Google Drawing document opens up, and I can see already a couple people joining here. And so in this document, we mapped sort of 2 dimensions: level of participation from high and low, and relationships to participants sort of from close to distant. And so it would be great if you could sort of add maybe take a shape here from the top menu, and sort of add yourself and map your experiences with participation. So I created this square here, and I'm just adding my name I'm sort of thinking where, in my experience working with participants in design-based research projects, how high my level of participation has been, or how much I've involved people in my projects, and sort of how close or distant relationships may have been. And of course, these can be very diversely interpreted, those dimensions, and we're not trying to suggest that these are the only ways of sort of mapping out a participatory project, but we just wanted to get a feeling for who is here in the Hangout today. So please feel free to select a shape here from the top menu. Oh, this is feedback. Sorry about this. So we'll just take a minute until everybody sort of got settled, perhaps, and maybe tries to add a link, add a shape here. So I'm seeing Lindy here already, and if you haven't been able to open the document, you can find the link to the document in line 38 on the Etherpad. So we see a couple people joining us here, and a really diverse range maybe coming, hopefully. Well, so as we are adding our names sort of to these two dimensions, and you can certainly take a few more minutes to add yourself to the document, we'd like to maybe get started with sort of setting the context for our conversation here today. And so we'd like to kick off our conversation by asking you, Megan and Phil, to tell us a little bit about sort of design-based research and or maybe share some specific projects that highlight collaboration in the work that you've been involved with. And it would be really wonderful if you could include some information about sort of the setting of the research, the larger aim, and what you were hoping to get out of the work, and sort of the kinds of research questions that drove your work, and how these may change over the time of or the course of working, and how maybe participants were involved in contributing to these projects. And so to all those watching, please feel free to follow up with any questions you may have and adding those to the Etherpad. And so we will try to weave those questions in as we continue our conversation here.
That's great.
So, yeah, perfect.
Thanks, Anna. So Megan and I have pulled together some slides to think about kind of DBR and partnerships kind of in general terms, and then we have a couple of examples to share with you today. So I'm going to switch to our screen here, so you should all be able to see our slides at this point. So if that isn't working, I hope somebody lets us know. Should be doing the right thing. All right, so as we kind of find our way into this, we kind of wanted to, I know that the previous webinars have already been opening up design-based research. We wanted to kind of do a little bit of kind of work for folks that might be kind of new to design-based research, and then we'll kind of talk about kind of equity and partnerships specifically, and then we'll move on to the examples. So kind of as we kind of find our way in, just kind of in a diagrammatic way, trying to lay out kind of what this work looks like. So design research partnerships, this broad set of engagements, strategies, integrate research and practitioner perspectives to co-design, test, refine, and adapt in iterative ways. Tools, routines, context, and many other things can really depends on the project and the kinds of work that people are doing. Could be online spaces, could be program environments, could be community relationships and strategic ways, and that those are embedded in educational improvement efforts, and those again can happen in different sectors and different kind of arrangements of groups. So kind of in a nutshell, that's a bit of what the work is about. To kind of pop up a level, this is kind of a classic image of design-based research, talking about if you think across the multiple attempts to theorize a learning environment, to realize it, to develop it, to bring that to life in an actual setting, and then to study it. Like, this brings us through cycles of theorizing, designing, developing, enacting with data collection and analysis. And that's really kind of at a macro level, because in the day-to-day work of doing a design-based research study, all sorts of smaller cycles of improvement and reflection and analysis happen. But at a broad scale, this is kind of the iterative cycle, and it's a kind of a signature quality of the method. So Carl Breiter and others have kind of argued that DBR is the only method we have in the social sciences focused on cultivating and studying innovation as a thing. And I think that's one of its unique roles in learning sciences and education more generally. And this is like the focus of today, typically conducted by distributed expertise groups or partnerships, bringing together people with different kind of histories and commitments and kind of roles within the shared work that comes together, and we'll open that up. DBR studies tend to be multi-method, and it really depends on the theory work that's being done kind of within the study in terms of what you're using to get kind of empirical traction on the learning phenomena and outcomes of interest.
Phil, let me just interrupt you for 1 minute. We are still are on slide 1, so should your slides be advancing, or are we still on slide 1?
It should be.
Okay.
Let me pop.
Oh, there we go. So yeah, we missed slides 1 through 9, but that's okay.
Yeah,
Do you want to just kind of go through those slides 1 through 9 really quick so we could see some of those great visuals?
We kind of quickly catch up. So this is the lovely build that you all missed. So just to kind of get a sense of the work of a design research partnership. And I won't kind of narrate the slide, but this is the iterative kind of macro cycle of the work as you kind of go through phases of different dimensions of the work, and then here we are. So yes, so there's an argument to say that design-based research kind of sits alongside other forms of educational inquiry, that it's different and unique in that way, that it's intervention-driven and theory development in relation to realizing and studying those interventions, but it's kind of on that same list of things as historical, experimental, interpretive methods, and so it's really a broad tradition and not just one thing. And in a paper in 2004, I was kind of highlighting how design-based research, if you're doing cultural historical activity theory versions of the work, it's going to look different and have a different way of kind of evolving over time than if you're doing more sociocognitive work or other theoretical families. So it's kind of a broad method that kind of has different families living within it.
So part of what we're going to share today is the ways that we're taking up DBR and really trying to center on equity. And both of us sort of think about this as building on some of the work with Chris Gutierrez, Susan Juro, and Shireen Usuji around just social design experiments. And what I really want to highlight here is that, one, it's focused on issues of expansive learnings and experiences through participatory design or co-design. And really this idea that Chris and Susan sort of articulated as exploring what's possible in partnerships with non-dominant communities using a grammar of hope, possibility, and resilience. So how is it we really take up those kinds of sensibilities while we're engaged in DBR work? So we're going to think a little bit then for us about how we engage critical theory and design research more specifically. And we think a bit about this from, this is a quote from Jean Lave, but how is it that you construct what the problematics are? A problematic includes assumptions. She suggests an ontology and epistemology and ethic about relations between persons and world, the nature of human beings and how it, the nature of human beings and how it is produced, and in what terms we can know it, and the nature of knowledge. So really, we're trying to push here to say, how are all of these things a part of, either explicitly or implicitly, in DBR work? So one way to think about this is, this is a quote from Habermas, but it's really to develop a kind of a politic that is engaged in, that is represented in DBR. And Habermas talks about a critical theory model of ethnography in which the social life is represented and analyzed for the political purpose of overcoming social oppression, particularly forms that reflect advanced capitalism through overt polemics of the researcher. And part of what we're getting at here is there isn't sort of, in our perspective, or that there isn't an apolitical DBR study. And so it's really trying to elevate how are these things embedded in the work that we're doing. So one of the things that Phil and I do, we co-teach a class, and we really try to encourage folks as they're learning this method is to be better at articulating what your politic is associated with your DBR study. And how does that shape what goals you're after, and subsequently how you make design decisions, how you might structure DBR projects, and partly that's where this idea of co-design emerges from. And partly it means also to suggest that we need a clear sort of grammar of how does our DBR work represent progress or improve. You can talk about improvement, you can talk about it as equity, from a contemporary perspective of education and learning.
Megan, can I just interrupt you quickly with, we do have a question, and you're presenting such a rich theoretical kind of frame for this work. It's very exciting, but we do have a question, and that is from Karen, and Karen wants to know, how is design-based research different from teacher or researcher participant research, so teacher research or action research, or participant research, which has an activist slant. So I know that, Phil, in your 2004 Educational Psychologist article, you talked about the nomenclature of DBR. So can you, both of you, kind of talk about how you see DBR as being different from participatory action research or some of these other paradigms?
Yeah, I'll say two just sort of concrete things. I think that there are lots of nuances about this, but first, DBR is theory-driven, and it is after what Cobb and NGSS called ontological innovations and learning theory. So one of the things about DBR is that we are after expanding what we know about foundational knowledge around learning and teaching, potentially. And I do think that becomes a really important piece. There are many ways that you can go about that, right? Sort of connecting with Phil's piece about there are different families. But it is an outcome desired that I do think makes it different than participatory action research. I also think that the continuous improvement, those iterative cycles, I think certainly participatory action research can do that, but I don't know that it always does. There's often a desired outcome for participatory action research, and it's not always, it can be, but it's not always this stance towards iterative building and learning, frankly, as embedded in the method. And so there's some really different kinds of orientations that open up in DBR work. I often think that part is a part of the kind of DBR work that I do, just to say that. But I definitely have lots of colleagues that are PAR researchers that are not after foundational understandings of learning.
I guess the only thing I would add is that I think DBR often is done by interdisciplinary teams of folks working together for sustained periods in ways that I think are less common in at least the action research kinds of endeavors that I've seen. Just so you do have a division of labor and a kind of a capacity to do different dimensions of the work differently when you do have a team in place. And that might show up like deeper development work because you have a technologist who's able to kind of develop a new kind of, set of experiences and tools, or it could be because you have graduate students who kind of sink in and do very detailed empirical analysis to inform something that you don't always get kind of in action research endeavors just because of the way they're structured.
I'll also just say, on the flip side, DBR cannot have some of the sensibilities that I think that question probably was prompted from, right? So I think that probably some of us who are equity focused in DBR work tend to resonate with PAR kinds of orientations, but there are plenty of people that do DBR work that wouldn't resonate, so that question would play out differently depending upon your politic.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Sure. So there's been kind of a long history of DBR going back into the late 80s, early 90s when it got formalized. Recently, and a lot of that work has been kind of what I would think of now as kind of small, pitched, focused partnerships doing kind of deep work within particular settings, and that's relatively small scope in the grand scheme. More recently, there's been a transition kind of in a broader landscape of education around research practice partnerships. So these are long-term collaborations where researchers and practitioners come together to investigate problems of practice and try to work towards solutions that serve kind of their interests. And they're doing similar work to leverage the distributed expertise, but they are working often in a broader scale. There's a flavor of research practice partnerships that are design focused as well, that has kind of a resonance to DBR historically. So they're place-based. You're doing that improvement work locally, but generalizing knowledge about teaching and learning to theory. And you're doing that collaborative work at every step of the process between research and practice. Bill Penuel and colleagues in 2011 kind of framed a specific methodological approach called design-based implementation research that has been growing and gaining traction, which is systems-level improvement and theory development through design partnerships. And you're really, from an equity stance then, developing and testing innovations that can improve the quality and kind of equitable distribution of supports for implementation of reforms. The piece that he was doing with Barry Fishman to kind of frame kind of how you can work at broader scale across systems. So just to kind of pull that into focus with some principles, DBIR is focused on addressing persistent problems of practice that are broadly felt within these communities. You have the multiple stakeholder points of view being coordinated kind of in the work. You're engaging educators, the diversity of folks in iterative co-design in that way, and we'll show in the example coming later. And you're actually developing theoretical knowledge, which we've talked about, but you're also building capacity to do ongoing continuous improvement work, which is maybe the ultimate contribution, actually, to get people within these spaces to work across research and practice divides in ongoing, productive ways. So this is a bit of, I think the partnership dimension now. We're going to transition to the examples. Partnerships clearly recenter the work off of research-driven initiatives to focus on issues of educational practice. As Megan was saying, they allow for kind of this identification and study of ontological innovation, and you can think of connected learning phenomena as being a version of that too, to understand new ways of arranging for learning and to study that in ways that are novel from the theory point of view. You're leveraging the distributed expertise. It can shift the decision-making process. So often practitioners have decisions made for them by other people outside of the community, and that can happen through curriculum or through policies from the district and pacing guides and different things. And these kind of partnerships actually allow for the locus of decision-making to shift within fields of practice, within communities, within some of the work that happens, and we'll be talking about that. And we'll talk a lot more about how just the shared governance strategy across research and practice helps disrupt classic hierarchies of university and school relationships that have been in place. So we're about ready to dive into examples. I guess I'll pause and see if there are any other questions that we should think about before we do that.
Let's see. Anna, are there any questions from the Etherpad that you'd like to shoot Megan and Phil right now?
So I don't see any questions on the Etherpad at the moment.
Okay.
And so I think it would be actually really great to dive into the examples and sort of see a little bit more and practice and how that relationship to design-based research and collaboration really comes out.
Great.
So I'm going to just put this in front of both of our examples a little bit. Both Phil and I are thinking about what this moment in time is, and really thinking about how we are working towards the implementation of the new vision for K-12 science education and how it should center on equity. But we're going to do this in two different ways. I'm going to talk about an informal project, and Phil's going to talk about one that's in schools and with teachers. And we're probably going to go fairly quick, so please do interrupt if there's clarifying questions. So I'm going to try to sort of just give enough context. A lot of the work that I do is really focused on Indigenous peoples in science education, and it's built on a really foundational idea around how science is a particular narrative of the natural world. And I just have a couple of quotes up here that we've really been thinking about this, that there's some people talk about this as Indigenous knowledge systems, some people have thought about this as Indigenous ways of knowing, but we've really been after sort of foundationally understanding what is the difference about the ways that people understand and make knowledge about the natural world. And when you do that, if you have really different stances about those things, how does that play out in science learning environments? And I'll say that we're not really interested in not engaging kids in sort of what I would call normative Western science, but the question is, can we produce learning environments that actually honors what I would call epistemic heterogeneity towards multiple ends? So we've been involved, and I'm going to tell you about a project with 4 different communities for a long time, since 2004, and we've been intentional about constructing these partnerships between both Indigenous communities in urban and rural settings and non-Indigenous communities in both rural and urban settings. And part of the reason that we constructed the design this way was because we are also working on these foundational ideas about learning, and this design reflects are partly ways to push back on some of the claims in the broader literature about culture and learning specifically. And I could say more about that, but I'm just going to leave that here for now. One thing that's really, just to say, so many people have no idea where the Menominee Nation is, and it's in Wisconsin here, so there's an image of that. In our work, we have been really interested in how is it that we both improve our foundational knowledge and engage in developing learning environments that contribute to the capacity and needs of Native nations to effectively respond to 21st century demands. And do that specifically through a focus on science education, right? So we're talking about 21st century demands that are related to science. But also contribute to the resiliency and cultural continuity of our communities, and I'll say more about that. But that partly is a politic about the fact that formal education, at least in the United States, has been intentionally directed to negate our cultural continuity, to really assimilate Native peoples into Western paradigms. And then our last 2 is how do we cultivate the innovation and creativity of our youth, of Native youth, towards authentic futures. And what that means is how is it we help them construct futures that don't sort of perpetuate the kind of academic, ethnic identity divide that is well documented in the literature, but also tends to be one where in which Native people see science and scientists as something not Native. So we're really conscious of those things. And then our 4th kind of goal is to contribute to foundational knowledge about human learning and development. Just to give you an overview of the kind of study that I'm going to tell you about, this actually was it's a 7-year study. It started out as 3 and continued to extend. And it's really when we first started trying to articulate what is this community-based design process and what does it look like. And I'll tell you, it started out in particular ways, and there's a nice typo on my screen that I'm noticing. But in year 1, we really started figuring out what does it look like to engage in community-based design, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a bit. And we also conducted a pilot week program, but we started really setting up what's the infrastructure of this. it continued so that the next couple of years we iterated on that. We ended up engaging teachers in that process more specifically, and then we actually continued to expand. This started out as a summer program and ended up being, we designed for an entire sort of round, year-round programming in a local community center. I should say that about our work that we tend to also end up with these other layers that we're doing at the same time we're designing, and we call them cognitive mini-studies to support or test sort of our curricular innovations. But we also engage in the studies of everyday practices, and part of our point there is to try to understand what are the kinds of informal pedagogies that are happening in Indigenous communities specifically, but I would say that none of what I'm going to say today really isn't relevant to non-dominant communities in general, and maybe everybody. But we had the stance that part of what we needed to understand is how is it that communities are navigating and making sense of making meaning in the world in ways that are expansive already, and what can we learn from that? So that's really what we ended up focusing on, everyday practices.
Oh, Megan, so just we have a quick question from Karen also. Can you talk a little bit about the research team? What was the size of the research team? And it looked like on slide 30 that you were not using doctoral students or graduate students, but community members.
Let me get there, because I'm going to spend a lot of time on that in a second.
Great. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So I want to give a kind of high level, what are some key sensibilities that we have come to articulate around community-based partnerships and community-based design research, and then I'm going to try to continue to tell a story about these projects to kind of populate these. So one thing that we've really engaged in is that in community-based design research, an idea of critical historicity becomes really, really important. That is, how is it you account for the ways that families and communities have experienced schooling in science, and science specifically in our case, and how is that intentionally integrated into what you're doing? We've developed a sense of place-based. Phil said some things about this, but how is it that you understand the kinds of places that families and communities are engaged with the kinds of phenomena that you're trying to teach about or design learning or environments around? One of the things that's become really important for us is to recover a sense of intergenerational learning. Schools are designed exactly the opposite, and so we've really been after understanding how is intergenerational learning happening and what does that do for learning environments. This idea of navigational pedagogies, and this is really about that epistemic heterogeneity that I was speaking about. Sort of more in a nuts and bolts kind of view, we've thought really deeply, more than we ever anticipated, about how the constructions of roles and leadership are both conceptualized at the beginning and how they expand over time, and I'll tell you more about that. The idea of shared governance and decision making, being very deliberate around the distribution of resources, and I'll talk about that too. And the last one that we are continuing working to articulate is how is it that you're engaging in strategic transformations of institutional relations and institutional relationships with families and communities specifically, especially those from historically underrepresented and historically marginalized communities. So in this particular project that I'm going to tell you about that started back in 2004, we were really deliberate. It really started with this idea of how do we rethink what it looks like to design. And the first part that I'm just going to attend to right now is that we really wanted to locate the center of gravity in the community, not the university, right? Not in schools. It was in the community. And so, you know, Fred Erickson's talked about this, is about how is it that you locate, where do you put the social gravity of the work, and what comes along with wherever you center that gravity. And so one of the things that we also were really deliberate about is that we were engaged in collaborative projects, not subcontracts, and that matters for university folks. There's an economy to research, and in community organizations often don't have the same kinds of access to the basic infrastructure that gives universities access to resources. So our university, so Northwestern at the time, was incredibly generous in thinking about themselves as an institutional mentor and helped our community organizations not only apply directly to a place like the National Science Foundation, but work on things like their financial infrastructure, IRB, their indirect cost agreements, all of those things that many non-dominant communities simply don't have the institutional history with to know how to navigate. And so those things become extra labor. The other thing that we were really intentional around was making sure that we were engaging with tribal nations IRB approvals and making sure that the nations themselves were approving and supporting the work, which that can get complicated to think about, but how is it that communities have a say in the work in really meaningful ways, to the point that they could end it if they chose to? And most partnerships don't have that kind of a mechanism. To get more specific, though, is how is it that we went about designing? So for us, a key question was, who defines and participates in the problem analysis? How does design, whose needs are being responded to, what opportunities, simply who's designing and towards what ends? And historically, Phil mentioned this before, for us when we started thinking about this, students from non-dominant communities, decision makers are not drawn from communities. And for Native communities, as I said, who's been deciding what our kids should learn has not been from our communities for multiple generations. So we really thought about what that meant. So our design teams were made up of elders and cultural bearers, parents and guardians, youth, young adults, other community adults. We had some content experts that were degreed and not. And then we have a few researchers and some emergent researchers. I should say when I started, so I was an emergent researcher, right? I started doing work in my own home community while I was in graduate school. So it really changed what was possible, in part because people used to say, well, I knew you before you were fancy. And so that sort of laid out a different kind of social configuration there. Part of what I wanted to talk about is that in the early parts of our design, we really ended up engaging in what we call critical reflective co-design practices, and I'm just highlighting two here. And really what's important about these is that we spent a lot of time talking through what oftentimes people would say might be something like being off topic. And we probably spent more time in the beginning of this partnership really engaging, and we think about them as oral mapping projects that really brought everyone's experiences and perspectives. It made them visible. They also were built off of community practices, but they really focused on giving the space and resourcing the space for folks to be talking about their lived, felt, and how they've responded to the kinds of experiences. For them, this was about, and for all of us, it was about generating a kind of theory of how we got to where we are. And we were intentional about being very expansive about that. So I'll just say, in our early time, our time scale about constructing a theory of how we got to where we are spanned hundreds of years. And for us, being able to make the space to do that signaled to our partners that we were really serious about this. The other thing I'll say is that when we did some of these oral mappings, there was also material artifacts that came out of this, and part of what it did was also open up the kinds of contradictions in people's perspectives and sort of our understandings of what was happening. We ended up being really specific about using this as a reflective practice for a while, and I will say that often in the beginning of this, it probably took us a solid year and a half of meeting every other week or at least once a week for 2 to 4 hours with groups of like 20 to 40 people.
And Megan, we have another question, and that is, so how did you recruit the participants, and how were you able to get them to kind of invest that amount of time? You said 2 to 4 hours every other week. Were they just really gung-ho and excited to, be asked, or how did you kind of start that?
Two things. I happen to be the director of education at a community center within the community at the time, so I kind of knew community really well, and we put out a couple of different ways to do it. One, we just started talking about the project way before it started, and why. So it was already an ongoing conversation, and what we ended up having people do is that they had to get themselves, so they were nominated, and then we actually had folks from community. One of the ways that we set this up is that you had to have 10 people nominate you, and it wasn't so much a nomination, it was that you were solidifying that you were going to be the person to make sure that those 10 people always knew what was going on. And it was the way that we set up to make sure that there was an informal network of communicating about the project. And so as long as people came with that, anybody could come. It's partly why our design circles were sometimes huge and sometimes small. We generally developed a stance that saying anyone can come would be fine. It might mean that some meetings were huge and unruly, but over time we ended up with a kind of a core team that was about 20 people that were really regularly participating. Two other things that I'll say, though, is that we also literally these projects became jobs. So two things around equitable distribution of resources. We paid designers, and not very much, but we paid them. We made sure that they weren't incurring any cost to themselves to participate. And then we ended up, over time, as you'll see in this slide, people ended up deciding what kinds of roles. And these actually became mostly, so designers never became like jobs. It was more that you got stipends for participating in meetings. But out of this group, people chose their roles. And some of these roles they were paid jobs as part of it. So it wasn't that the researchers had jobs to do this work, or just sort of what we might think of as typically teachers employed. It's that out of this, people decided, and collectively people decided, who was going to take on specific roles and be the leaders in the projects. So one of the things that I'll say about this, and we learned this later, is that this evolution of roles and people deciding is really important, at least in our experience, because it meant for collective decision making, and because resources are involved, it made that very transparent. People knew who was going to decide to take on the leadership role. People knew that that meant they were getting a job, and that meant that they were going to be investing more of the time. When we assigned roles beforehand, so we tried a different time where it wasn't this emergent process, it was very contentious. And it was very contentious both in our reflective practices, but in who got chosen and how they got chosen. So this process was far more community informed and collectively decided, and it meant that everyone had a different stance to the work. One of the things after, at least in the project that I'm trying to focus on here, is after this happened, we really started to change how, and after the first implementation, where we didn't see the things happening that we wanted to have happen. And really the reflective process led us to this idea like, well, we're not doing what we want the kids to do, so we better do it ourselves. And we, this first quote is from an elder, that in order for us to teach us to our youth, we need to do it together first. And it became that everyone was really conscious of the fact that we were teaching from our own experiences collectively, as opposed to the places that we were trying to innovate towards. So we began walking and talking specific places in order to consider the learning affordances of those places and deciding on the core focal phenomena. And there's lots to say about this, but we literally went from designing at tables in buildings to only having design meetings while we were walking the places that we were going to take kids, and then coming back and thinking about, are there things that we're going to do with kids inside places? So this is kind of a view of all the different places. This particular project was in Chicago that I'm talking about. The little red flags are all the kind of anchoring places where we would walk, get to know as designers and teachers and researchers, and then is also the places where we anchored all of our implementations and units. And I'll say that part of what's the circle that has a little white circle is the community center, and it's where we started. And one of the things that started happening is that we started there, but the work led us to continue to expand to other locations. And so as people engaged in this process, they started to experience the nature of our work expanding over throughout Chicago, which was really powerful for everyone involved because it changed the way that they oriented to Chicago. And I have lots to say about that, but I'll leave it there for now. I do want to kind of end with two things. Is that so this was the initial project was a long one. It was 7 years. But what ended up happening is that we've evolved into multiple projects from insights into this original one. So in 2011, we had recognized that people were bringing their small children and all of these kinds of in this work, even though it was focused on middle school students. Very quickly, it became all ages. We still continue to research the impacts on middle school students' learning, but they brought families, right, and they had little kids. So community asked for a focus on early science learning for 3 to 5, and we kind of kept going with this idea of intergenerational learning in a community-based citizen science project. And now we have, 2 proposals out to kind of continue to expand and think about what we learned. So I'll just, this is sort of our early science learning work, and it really resonates with our earlier work, but is trying to take up more specifically how do you make spaces for early science learning. This is, again, just extensions of the previous work. I mean, there are some important variations and changes in research questions, but the sort of infrastructure and practice is still very similar. And then the last thing that I want to kind of end on is that we've also been working towards what does it mean to be engaged in co-partnerships or participatory design, and we've been playing with this idea around axiological innovation. So if you're in a relationship with a community for 12 years, in a partnership, what are you learning about the kinds of new political relationships and new kinds of ethical relationships that makes this work possible? And how is it that new projects and foci emerge, and where do you take those up? One of the things that is complicated about a project that is 12 years long is that there are shifts in peoples and histories with the partnerships. How is it that you bring in new people to a longer-term partnership? And then how do you continue to think about what I'm calling stabilizing innovations and expanding partnerships, particularly in non-dominant communities? And so we've been thinking about how is it that you expand some of these insights to new communities. We have a new project with a community here in Seattle. Been playing with how is it you engage in state-level engagement, and it's both through OSPI, but also I'm engaged with a project that works with 72 nonprofits that serve Native communities, and which is a kind of crazy idea that you might partner with that many people. Well, at least right now that feels crazy to me. And then we're also thinking about expanding fields. So we've learned lots of things that are relevant to the fields of family engagement in our process, and how are we thinking about that? I think that's it.
So we're at an inflection point here between first example and second. So I wonder if there are comments or reactions around Megan's example before we turn to the DBIR example.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. That was such a rich and amazing example of how you've started these partnerships and expanded over 12 years. I think some of the folks who are very new to this work are wondering if you can give any tips about just how to get started. Do you recommend going out in the community and getting involved? But if you're just at kind of the very beginning stages, what tips might you have for getting started in this work?
Well, we've had lots of people want to become involved in our projects, and I'll tell you, I used to say to someone, okay, if you want to become involved, then you need to come hang out in the community center and serve our elders for lunches for a set number of weeks. And I would often get graduate students who felt like, that's not research, I don't want to do that. And what they didn't understand is that I was saying that you need to actually understand the community. And we weren't really formal about calling that an ethnography. We were really intentionally about saying you need to start to form some relationships. And part of it is that for us in our community, that if you walked in saying, I want to do a research, it sets the partnership off on the wrong note. Because research is not like formal education. Research has also not been used often in Native communities' best interest. And so we really were intentional about saying to people is that your first step is really getting to know people in community and starting to understand the flows of what's happening. What does it look like to be a part of this community? And so I think that doing that first, before you come in with too much of a structured agenda, if you're going to try to partner with communities, is really, really important. And I also think, I often tell people this, I didn't say this here, I kind of came into this first partnership as, I knew lots of people, but I was fairly convinced that I knew what we should do. Really at the beginning. And that first design meeting, I still remember, as a graduate student, I learned all about how kids pay attention to animals more than they do plants, and that we have all kinds of developmental theories about that. And the elders in the room wanted us to focus on plants. And at first I was adamant, like, no, that's not going to work. Kids don't care about plants. And I was totally informed by graduate school. I was also humble enough to realize that I was starting to violate cultural practices almost immediately by using the research to suggest that community-based knowledge or desires weren't the right entrance point. And so I sat with it quietly, and it took us, one, they were right, just to say that, and we've been able to innovate that and prove that in all kinds of ways that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise. But two, it really meant that it opened up the possibilities of really new insights into what we should be doing and how we should be doing it. So I would say those two things, and I think you can do formal ethnographies, but I also think it really is a focus on how are you going to build relationships and do it without it already being a charged relationship.
That is thank you so much, Megan. That's so helpful, and our audience members are just so impressed with the level of depth and breadth of your work, so thank you so much. Phil, we just have about 12 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions, but I want to give you an opportunity to use kind of the bulk of the remainder of our time to tell us about your project and your work.
Yeah, I'll do what I can to kind of leave us some time at the tail end here. And
sounds good.
So I'll stay at a kind of a little bit higher level. We've been funded by the National Science Foundation to basically transcend the research to practice paradigm of work, where we know that the gulf between research and practice is just something that needs a different approach. And so we're able to explore kind of teacher-researcher partnerships to collaboratively investigate problems of practice and to develop strategies and try them out and refine them that might be useful locally and more broadly. And we're doing that in collaboration with our partners shown there across those 4 themes of work. So I'm going to kind of leave it there at the broad initiative level, and then talk quickly about a district-led project that we're then bringing our collaboratory resources and focus to. So within the new vision for science education is a transition towards the disciplinary practices of science and engineering, and there's a lot of kind of equity-focused potential for improvement of learning conditions through the practice turn that's now in play, and that shows up within kind of transitions to learner agency for knowledge construction and mapping it to relevant problem context. It has to do with relating and broadening kind of the sense-making practices across everyday and disciplinary perspectives. It has to do with leveraging cultural funds of knowledge and kind of just historical ways of making sense of the natural world in ways that are new too. So this partnership was focused on practices. It's a collaboration that's really led by Seattle Public Schools and Renton School District and the science staff within those buildings, the curriculum and science staff, and partnered with a nonprofit that does work in systems biology and a couple of units on the University of Washington campus, including our institute. Just quickly, it is a systems level approach to shifting the curriculum materials for the district through curriculum adaptation as a collaborative practice. So we're working with ranging between 80 and 100 teachers per year across these 2 urban districts to engage in small group redesign of existing kind of curriculum material infrastructure to take into account the disciplinary practices that are in the new vision. And so part of the move here is really a teacher agency shift to let kind of practitioners with expertise for designing and shaping learning experiences to help shape and redesign the material infrastructure of curriculum for these 2 large districts through a multi-year process. And researchers are embedded within that space and engaged in the detailed work, and I'll just quickly kind of talk about that a little bit. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, we're in year 2. We're kind of lining up for another year, and we just found out we have 3 more years of good work to do at slightly different grade band levels, with now a kind of a leading focus on designing for kind of culturally and linguistically diverse learners as a foregrounded focus of the work that we've now been able to kind of navigate that part of our axiological conversation to like have that as a leading design focus. And so it's unfolding, and it's a big complicated effort across the region here. Just to give you a taste of what we're trying to understand, part of it is across the advice networks of teachers that are pre-existing and newly established parts of their networks, what is flowing for them above and beyond kind of what the work is to adapt curriculum. So what ideas, what materials, what tools, what resources from professional development flow through their networks for people within the project, but then more interestingly outside of the project. So we have 11 teachers going back to do building level PDs using the resources from the project with their entire faculty within their buildings. And to have that be a kind of a sanctioned district activity is a shift in one of the districts for sure, and part of the move to reposition teachers to be kind of in that teacher leadership development pathway and to kind of be in those spaces where they can help kind of shape improvement. So we have a set of tools that are kind of coming off of this. We identify problems of practice, and if you want to know more, you can go to stemteachingtools.org. We're trying to build resources that can more broadly inform the issues of implementation while maintaining kind of an equity integrated perspective around those issues, and these are starting to get used more broadly across the country in ways that are interesting. So just to kind of move towards closure and to leave some time for discussion, I tried to kind of attend a little bit to the questions that we're kind of framing today's session. So one had to do, how do you learn about the context before you engage in design? Well, we have the luxury of having a team on our side with 5 doctoral students who do a lot of ethnographic field work out in the classroom sites, and we can understand details of particular parts of those 2 districts in quite a bit of significant depth. We do teacher interviews and district staff interviews more broadly to get a sense of the broader fabric, and it's a curriculum project, so we do curriculum walkthroughs to understand aspects of the current situation. The relationship building part of the collaboration is interesting, and I think it underscores a lot of what Megan has already put on the table. We have a long-standing relationship with some of the people in the collaboration on the school side, going back, 12, 15 years at this point. And so it's almost like a series of projects that have developed over time through trusted networks across research and practice. And so how you get started in that is you do what Megan was saying, like you engage in that work collaboratively, you start building those lasting relationships, and you start shifting your focus to find relevant projects to stay in co-design kinds of work with them. And so we do a lot of that work. Sometimes your trusted allies will then introduce you to other people, and you get to expand the network through that way. People vouch for you. The teachers, the stance is different. Like, just because we have 100 teachers and we don't know too many of them, and the work there is for researchers to integrate at the table and not sit off on the side in their own research space, or not to drop in for a day or two and then disappear, but it's to be there fully and actually engage in the work and engage in learning around the work along with the other professionals in the room. And so it's really that embedded stance that's important. Engaging in co-design, we do that within the context of the work. Ultimately, at the leadership level, they have the social contract with the public around education, so they make the final decision on design-related things. We give input and we share our thinking, but ultimately we're advisors to them. With the teachers, we get to be in their spaces, co-teach, identify problems of practice that emerge, figure out tools and solutions with them, sometimes go a little bit deeper because we have more time in our life in certain ways to go and look at background research and things, and then kind of work in that direction. My impulse is actually to hold the last 4 minutes for a little bit more interactive Q&A, and I'll just leave my last slide sitting here. So if people want to ask about one of the things I didn't get to put on the table, we can go that way. But I think Anna, we'll see if there are any questions or reflections that people want to share in the last few minutes.
Sure, thank you so much. Wow, there's just a lot to digest here, Phil. Karen had a question about the data. Do participants have a say in kind of the data that's collected? Are they involved in data analysis? Can you talk, both Megan and Phil, briefly about data in your research?
Sure. I mean, we're using full-on IRB sorts of processes around the data, and so everyone gets to make informed consent around what data gets collected in relation to what their world is. So there is that part of it. I will say that we have kind of two levels of our relationship with teachers. We work with all 100 through the 9 days of professional development that are part of the district work, but then for a couple dozen, we're actually in their classrooms in a much more deeper collaborative relationship, and those are overwhelmingly consented spaces where then we do much more fine-grained collaborative work with them. Certainly, we bring some of the data back to the professional development spaces for shared analysis and thinking around student work or reflections on particular, video recorded moments, and so it has that kind of relationship with the teachers. With the district folks, a whole additional level of detail, kind of data shared work happens. So the district's very interested in the social network analysis. They're trying to understand how these ideas are spreading, if they spread across districts, if they spread to people outside of the funded project, and how that is happening. And so that is kind of ongoing work to then think about that. You want to join in?
I'll just say quickly that in our work, the community members who were not researched beforehand become involved in all parts of it. So there's the capacity building of how is it that you collect data, what sorts of data on all kinds of levels. And then the same thing with analysis is that, in our work, community partners are developing coding schemes, actually doing the work in whether it was in vivo or deduce, learning how to run statistics. When we run statistics, participating in writing manuscripts, participating in presenting work. We've also engaged in community research conferences, which really is another way for us to think about how are we distributing these kinds of findings in our work within community contexts as opposed to just sort of academic conferences or the usual modes of dissemination.
And I'll just underscore that the collaborative presentation and authoring of the research is actually such a deep way to kind of more deeply coordinate perspective and ideas. Like, I think we all know that for those of us that are in interdisciplinary spaces, but it's been really powerful for kind of researchers and practitioners to do that shared work together.
So one last question, and that's from Nick, and he wants to know, how do you talk to practitioners about this kind of work and this research without alienating them with kind of some of the academic discourse?
Very carefully. I mean, the interdisciplinary language problem is a big one, and you have to learn to code switch between spaces, and you have to be honest about the fact that sometimes you will slip up and you'll kind of talk about ontological innovation, and they should call it that. And actually, like, you need to kind of broker the social norm to kind of maintain kind of shared understanding in those spaces, and to give it time to develop that language.
Yeah, and I'll say two other things. One, I would say communities have more robust theories about inequities than oftentimes researchers do, frankly. And so I also think that there's a way to think about this. I will also say in our partnerships, we read academic texts together, and that we were intentional about actually not sort of keeping the language resources of the academy to the sort of folks that were there, and it was really important because it meant that we engaged, we opened that space in ways that, like, people make fun of how I talk all the time now, and I'm quite comfortable with that. Right? But it meant also that people could start locating our work. It expanded their possibilities for knowing what the power of the work was that we were doing together. It really expanded that agency too.
That's just amazing. Thank you so much, Megan and Phil. And Anna, I'll just turn it over to you to give us some last-minute wrap-up.
Perfect, thanks. This was such a rich discussion, and we prepared these 3 topics, and I feel like we really sort of crossed all 3 of them with our conversation iteratively. So I think that's really great. And I'm just reading this comment by Nick Wilson here, that I think also speaks to some of the overarching parts of establishing relationships and also sustaining those relationships. He writes, "Be persistent, be gracious, and be human." So I thought that's a really, really nice comment. But now that we're sort of at the end of our hour, I just wanted to take this last minute to thank Megan and Phil and all of you watching and participating on the Etherpad, and also to thank Jameson for all the technical help throughout the Hangout and also before. So next week, we'll be highlighting stories from the fields related to co-design and collaboration and design-based research, and really discuss past and ongoing projects, open questions, and so forth related to projects that will be presented by Nathan Phillips, Rebecca Woodward, Ryan Risch, and Krista Bowen. So we're really excited, looking forward to hearing about much more projects that relate to co-design and collaboration. And if you'd like to keep updated about DML Commons, please sign up to the newsletter at dmlcommons.net and follow us on Twitter, and we'll be posting resources, additional questions that we didn't have a time to get to in today's Hangout on Twitter as well. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Lindy. Thanks, everyone.
Sure.